You know the feeling. You are sitting across from someone, and for 20 minutes straight, they have talked only about their day, their problems, their opinions, their plans. You nod. You wait for a small opening to share something about your own life. It never comes. By the time the conversation ends, you feel tired, a little smaller, and slightly used, even though nothing bad technically happened. This happens at work, in friendships, even in family. It is quiet, it is common, and most people never learn how to handle it without becoming bitter or fake. Stoicism has a clear, calm answer for this exact situation. Before we get into it, if you find value in this channel, take a moment to hit like and subscribe. It helps this channel grow, and it helps this message reach more people who need to hear it today. Number 1. Why this bothers you more than you admit. Most people assume the irritation they feel around self-centered talkers is simply about time. They think, this person is stealing my time, my attention, my energy, and that is why I feel drained. But if you look closer, the real discomfort runs deeper than time management. It touches something more personal, the quiet hope that we matter to the people we spend time with. When someone talks only about themselves, session after session, a small voice inside asks whether we're truly seen by them, or just a convenient audience. That question, left unexamined, can quietly eat at your sense of worth in relationships you actually care about. The Stoics were deeply interested in this kind of hidden emotional reaction because they knew most suffering does not come from the event itself, but from the judgment we attach to it. Epictetus taught that people are disturbed not by things, but by their opinions about things. A one-sided conversation is just that, a conversation where one person spoke more. The sting you feel comes from the meaning you assign to it, that you are unimportant, unheard, or invisible. Once you notice this, you gain something valuable, the ability to separate the plain fact from the emotional story layered on top of it. It also helps to admit that some of the frustration is about unmet expectations. We enter conversations quietly expecting a certain exchange. I share, you share, we connect evenly. When that expectation is broken repeatedly, disappointment builds, and it starts to feel personal even when it may not be. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself, in his private writings, that people act according to their own understanding of good, shaped by their own nature and limitations. Someone who talks endlessly about themselves is usually not plotting to ignore you. They're simply acting from habit, insecurity, or a lack of awareness, not from any decision to make you feel small. There's also a subtler layer worth naming honestly: comparison. When you watch someone speak confidently and endlessly about their own life, a part of you may quietly compare your restraint to their boldness and wonder if you should be more assertive, more vocal, more centered on your own story. This comparison, left unchecked, can turn into self-criticism that has nothing to do with the other person at all. Recognizing this pattern early prevents you from carrying resentment that was never really about them, but about an old insecurity resurfacing through a new situation. Understanding why something bothers you does not mean you must accept poor treatment. Stoicism is not about numbing yourself to disrespect. It is about accuracy. When you know precisely what is triggering your frustration, a broken expectation, a comparison, a fear of being unseen, you stop reacting blindly and start responding with clarity. This is the first quiet victory, separating the surface irritation from the deeper, more honest reason it exists. Once separated, the emotion loses much of its grip because it is no longer vague and overwhelming, but specific and understandable. This self-examination is not a one-time exercise, but a habit worth returning to, especially before difficult conversations. Ask yourself plainly, is this frustration about them, or about an old story I'm telling myself regarding my own value? Most of the time, the honest answer softens the sharp edge of the emotion. You begin to see the self-centered talker not as a personal insult, but as a person shaped by their own long, unseen history, one you're not required to fix, but also do not need to be wounded by. This clarity is where real calm begins. Number 2, what you can and cannot control. At the very center of Stoic practice sits one distinction that changes everything: the difference between what is within your control and what is not. Epictetus opens his Enchiridion with this exact idea, dividing life cleanly into 2 categories. Your own judgments, choices, and actions belong to you. Other people's opinions, habits, and behavior do not. A person who dominates every conversation with talk of themselves falls entirely into the second category. You cannot force humility into someone, and you cannot rewrite years of habit with a single meaningful look across the table. Accepting this early removes an enormous, invisible weight. Many people waste enormous energy trying to control the uncontrollable. They rehearse clever comments meant to shift the conversation. They grow silently furious when their hints go unnoticed. They replay the exchange later, imagining better responses they should have given. All of this energy is spent trying to manage another person's behavior, which was never truly within reach to begin with. The Stoic approach redirects that same energy toward the only thing that was always yours to shape: your own reaction, your own boundaries, your own next choice in how you engage or disengage. This does not mean passivity. Focusing on what you control is not the same as accepting mistreatment quietly. It means you stop expecting a self-absorbed person to transform simply because you wish it, and instead you decide deliberately how much space you will give them in your life, your schedule, and your emotional attention. You might choose to shorten the conversation. You might choose to speak up plainly. You might choose to invest less in the friendship overall. These are all actions within your control, and they carry far more power than silently hoping the other person changes on their own. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire filled with flatterers, critics, and self-interested advisors, wrote to himself constantly about this same discipline. He reminded himself that other people's rudeness or self-absorption is their own concern, and his task was simply to remain just calm and unaffected by what does not belong to him. This was not cold indifference toward others. It was a practical method of protecting his own peace so that his judgment stayed clear, and so he could still act with fairness toward people who did not treat him with the same care. When you fully absorb this distinction, an interesting shift happens. The self-centered talker stops feeling like a threat to your inner peace, because your peace was never dependent on their behavior changing. Instead, it depends on your own steady response, something entirely inside your control. You can walk away from a long, one-sided conversation feeling completely unbothered, not because nothing happened, but because you correctly placed the event in the category where it belongs, something outside your control, therefore not worth internal suffering. This single mental move, practiced repeatedly, becomes one of the strongest tools you will ever build. Practically, this means training yourself to ask one simple question in the middle of these interactions. Is this mine to control, or theirs? If it is theirs, their habits, their self-focus, their lack of curiosity about you. Release your grip on it internally, even while still deciding externally how you will respond. If it is yours, your attention, your boundaries, your tone, your choice to stay or leave, take full ownership of it. Over time, this question becomes almost automatic, and the emotional exhaustion that once came from dealing with self-absorbed people fades considerably, replaced by a calm, grounded sense of authorship over your own experience. Number 3, understanding their nature without excusing it. Stoicism asks something difficult but valuable: to understand people as they actually are, not as we wish them to be. A person who talks only about themselves is, in most cases, not doing this out of malice. Often it comes from deep insecurity disguised as confidence, from a life where they learned early that being interesting was the only way to be valued, or simply from never having anyone model better conversational habits for them. This does not excuse the behavior, but it explains it, and explanation changes how heavily the behavior lands on you emotionally. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself, before facing difficult people each day, that he would meet the ungrateful, the arrogant, and the self-absorbed, because that is simply part of human life. He did not write this to lower his standards, but to remove surprise and personal offense from the equation. When you expect that some people, due to their own limited awareness, will center every conversation on themselves, you stop being shocked or wounded by it each time it happens. Expectation grounded in reality, rather than idealism, is one of the quiet gifts of Stoic thinking. There's also a useful reframe here. Most self-centered talkers are not acting from strength, but from a kind of quiet hunger. Constant self-focus often signals someone starving for validation, trying to fill an internal gap through external attention. Seeing it this way does not require you to become their therapist or personal audience. It simply removes the sting of taking it personally, because you begin to recognize the behavior as revealing something about their inner world, not a judgment about your worth or interest as a person. At the same time, Stoicism draws a firm line between understanding someone and excusing unlimited access to your time and energy. Compassion for someone's inner struggles does not obligate you to serve as an endless outlet for them. Seneca wrote extensively about guarding one's time as the most valuable possession a person has, more valuable than money, because time, once spent, can never be recovered. Understanding why someone behaves a certain way and still choosing to limit your exposure to that behavior are not contradictory. In fact, true Stoic wisdom requires holding both at once. This balanced view protects you from two extremes. One extreme is bitterness, where you begin to see every self-absorbed person as an enemy deliberately disrespecting you. The other extreme is self-erasure, where you tolerate endless one-sided exchanges simply because you understand their root cause. Neither serves you well. The steady middle path is clear-eyed compassion paired with firm boundaries, acknowledging their humanity and struggle, while still protecting your own time, attention, and dignity as things worth defending. Practicing this daily changes how these interactions feel from the inside. Instead of leaving a conversation thinking, that person is impossible, you begin to think, that person is struggling in a way I recognize, and I chose wisely how much of myself to give to that struggle today. This shift does not require you to fix them, save them, or even confront them directly every time. It simply requires seeing clearly, responding calmly, and refusing to let their unresolved patterns quietly dictate the terms of your own peace. Number 4, practicing detachment without becoming cold. One of the most misunderstood ideas about Stoicism is detachment. People often assume it means becoming distant, unfeeling, or robotic toward others. This is a misunderstanding of the philosophy. Stoic detachment does not mean stopping caring about people. It means not allowing your inner peace to be hostage to things outside your control, including other people's conversational habits. You can care deeply about someone and still refuse to let their self-centered pattern determine your emotional state for the rest of the day. These two things, care and inner steadiness, are not opposites. They can exist together. A useful way to practice this is by observing the conversation almost as a scientist would observe a pattern, rather than as a participant absorbing every word personally. Notice, without judgment, how often the topic returns to them. Notice your own body's reaction, the tightening, the urge to interrupt, the small sting of being unheard. This simple act of observing, rather than reacting instantly, creates space between the event and your response. In that space lies your freedom to choose calm over frustration, clarity over resentment. Epictetus used a helpful image. Think of life's events as a play where a role has been given to you by someone else, but how you perform that role remains entirely up to you. A self-absorbed friend may hand you the role of quiet listener today. You did not choose this role, but you choose how you inhabit it, with quiet irritation or with calm awareness that you're simply choosing for now to listen, and that choosing brings its own kind of freedom because it removes the feeling of being a helpless victim of the conversation. Detachment also involves releasing the need for the interaction to go a certain way. Many people silently demand, internally, that every conversation be balanced, deep, or mutually curious. When reality does not match this demand, disappointment follows automatically. Letting go of this rigid requirement does not mean lowering your standards for close relationships permanently. It simply means, in the moment, accepting the conversation as it actually is, rather than fighting against what is not. This acceptance, oddly, often reduces the emotional charge of the moment far more effectively than resistance ever could. It is worth noting that detachment is a practice skill, not an instant switch. The first few times you try to observe rather than react, you may still feel the old frustration rising. This is normal and expected. Seneca himself wrote candidly about his own struggles with irritation and impatience, showing that even dedicated Stoics were not immune to human reactions. The goal was steady practice, not instant perfection. Each time you choose calm observation over reactive frustration, even imperfectly, you strengthen a mental muscle that becomes easier to use the next time. With enough practice, something meaningful happens. You can sit through a completely one-sided conversation, contribute what feels appropriate, and walk away with your peace fully intact, not because you suppressed your feelings, but because you genuinely did not need the conversation to go differently for your inner state to remain steady. This is detachment in its true Stoic sense. Not coldness, not indifference to people, but a deep, quiet independence of your peace from other people's behavior, no matter how self-focused that behavior happens to be. Number 5, setting honest boundaries without guilt. Understanding and detachment are essential, but Stoicism is also deeply practical, and practicality sometimes requires direct action. There comes a point where simply managing your internal reaction is not enough, and a boundary must be spoken. This might mean gently redirecting the conversation, saying plainly that you would like to share something too, or limiting how often you make yourself available for one-sided exchanges. Boundaries are not a betrayal of Stoic calm. They are an expression of it because they come from clear thinking rather than suppressed resentment finally exploding. Many people avoid setting boundaries because they fear conflict or fear appearing unkind. But Seneca reminded his readers that time is the one resource we can never get back, and spending it carelessly out of fear of a brief, uncomfortable moment is its own kind of loss. A short, honest conversation about needing more balance in your exchanges is far less costly in the long run than years of quiet resentment building beneath a friendly surface. Boundaries, spoken calmly and without anger, are an act of self-respect grounded firmly in reason, not emotion. It helps to separate the boundary itself from the tone in which it is delivered. A Stoic boundary is not an angry accusation. It does not need to say, "You are selfish and exhausting." It can simply state a need clearly. "I would love to share something about my week too," or "I have about 10 more minutes before I need to head out." This kind of direct, unemotional honesty respects both people. It does not attack their character, but it firmly protects your own time and voice within the interaction. There will be moments where a boundary is met with surprise, defensiveness, or even mild hurt from the other person, especially if they are unused to being redirected. This is where your earlier internal work matters most, because you have already separated your own worth from their reaction. Their surprise or discomfort does not need to destabilize you. You can remain kind, remain calm, and still hold the boundary steady, because you understand their reaction belongs to them, while your right to a balanced exchange belongs entirely to you. Some relationships, despite honest boundaries, will remain persistently one-sided. In these cases, Stoicism does not demand endless tolerance. Epictetus was clear that we are not obligated to keep close company with those who consistently disturb our peace or fail to treat us with basic mutual respect. This might mean gradually reducing the closeness of certain friendships, not out of bitterness, but out of a calm, adult recognition that not every relationship needs to occupy the same space in your life. Distance, chosen deliberately and without cruelty, is a legitimate and mature Stoic response. The goal of boundary setting from a Stoic lens is never punishment or control over the other person. It is simply the honest, calm protection of your own limited time and attention, which are among the most valuable things you possess. When boundaries come from this grounded place, rather than from anger or exhaustion, they tend to be delivered more clearly, received more reasonably, and maintained more consistently. Over time, this practice teaches everyone around you, without a single lecture, exactly how much space you are willing to give and exactly how much you expect in return. Number 6, turning the experience into personal growth. Every difficult interaction, Stoicism teaches, contains material for growth if we choose to use it that way instead of simply enduring it. Dealing repeatedly with people who center every conversation on themselves offers a quiet but valuable mirror. It shows you exactly where your own patience wears thin, where your need for validation still lingers, and where your sense of self-worth may still depend too heavily on being noticed by others. Rather than only being an obstacle, these interactions become a genuine practice ground for the very qualities Stoicism values most: patience, clarity, and steady inner ground. Marcus Aurelius often reframed difficult people not as enemies to avoid, but as training partners for virtue. He wrote that obstacles placed in our path become the very path itself, meaning the challenge is not separate from the growth, it is the exact material the growth is made from. A self-absorbed colleague or friend, rather than simply being a burden to survive, becomes daily practice in patience, in clear communication, in detachment from things outside your control. Viewed this way, these encounters lose some of their heaviness, because they gain a clear and useful purpose. This experience also sharpens your own self-awareness in conversation. Watching someone talk endlessly about themselves without noticing the other person's silence can become an unexpectedly useful mirror. It may prompt an honest, private question. Do I sometimes do this too, in smaller ways, without realizing it? Stoicism strongly values this kind of self-examination, because growth rarely comes from judging others alone, but from using their behavior as a prompt to check our own habits with equal honesty and equal scrutiny. There's also a quiet strength that builds specifically through practicing patience with people who are difficult to be around. Seneca wrote that character, like iron, is shaped through friction, not through comfort alone. Every calm, grounded response you offer to a self-centered talker, instead of reacting with irritation or sarcasm, strengthens a capacity you will need in many other areas of life. Difficult coworkers, demanding family members, frustrating strangers. The specific situation changes, but the inner skill you are building, steady patience under mild provocation, transfers directly into nearly every relationship you will ever navigate. Over time, these encounters can even deepen your compassion, not in a naive or self-sacrificing way, but in a clear-eyed, grounded way. You begin to recognize the universal human hunger to be seen and understood, a hunger that sometimes expresses itself clumsily through excessive self-focus. Recognizing this in others often makes you gentler with your own occasional need for attention or validation, understanding it not as weakness, but as a common thread running through nearly everyone, including yourself at different points in life. In the end, learning to deal calmly and clearly with people who only talk about themselves is not really about them at all. It is a disciplined practice in self-command, understanding your own reactions, controlling only what is genuinely yours to control, setting honest boundaries without guilt, and extracting quiet personal growth from ordinary daily friction. This is Stoicism in its most practical form, not abstract theory reserved for philosophers, but a steady daily practice available to anyone willing to apply it, one ordinary, one-sided conversation at a time.